In this brief video, we're going to focus on discussing the product life cycle. Now, the product life cycle is essentially a series of stages that products, much like humans, go through from growth to maturity and until eventual demise, of course. And we know that products, of course, cannot last forever. And some go through the product life cycle to varying degrees. Some can go through them in a matter of weeks or months, and some can go through them for multiple decades and eventually be retooled or redesigned in a way to delay the process of inevitability, delay that process of ultimately meeting that demise, so to speak. So let's go through the product life cycle. What I want to do is walk you through the stages, and then what I'd like to do is give you a few examples so you get an idea of what types of products are in some of these stages, just to help kind of reinforce that basic idea here. So first thing I'm going to do here is just kind of draw a brief chart to work with. And then I'm going to draw a brief line right here. And this line is going to signify sales. And so sales are going to be obviously different at different points in time. And then we have a series of different stages that we ultimately have to work with here. And so in the first stage, which typically goes right about here, we call this the introduction stage. And so this is the first stage that products go through essentially when they reach the marketplace. And so you might ask, well, what are some characteristics of the introduction stage? In the introduction stage, remember, there's not a great deal of awareness about the product. The product has just come out. It's just been released to market. So the focus here is on raising awareness, on describing the different features and benefits. Advertising expenditures during this stage are very heavy because, once again, you're trying to raise awareness about your particular product. So you have very extensive promotional costs, very significant developmental costs as well. And so at this stage, typically you don't earn really any profit. You're usually operating at a loss because you're spending so much money simply so people know about you, and you're generally not doing very much in sales. That you're obviously operating at a deficit. So the goal, of course, we do want to get out of the introduction stage. No company can afford to be in this stage for a very long period of time, simply because of the resources that it actually takes to ultimately get out of this particular stage here. So some examples of products that are in the introduction stage, at least at the time of this particular recording, include things like 3D televisions, which most of us at least are somewhat aware of that technology now, so it's been around for a little while, but it really hasn't been widely adopted as of yet, right? We've seen commercials and different things for them, but you haven't seen just the huge adoption rates that would be necessary to take that particular product into the growth stage, which is the second stage. The next thing that we look at, or next example of products in the introduction stage, are electric vehicles. We've seen the push towards being more socially responsible and more environmentally conscious, if you will. And so part of that is developing technologies related to reducing harmful emissions caused by most automobiles. However, you really haven't seen them widely adopted yet. Once again, we're very familiar that electric cars are in existence and are being developed, but we haven't seen a large number of people adopt them as of yet, which keeps it in that intro stage. And so you do see some advertisements and different things done to try and raise awareness about the different features, about the benefits, why, of course, we cannot live without this particular product. But you don't see the wide adoption rates that are necessary to transfer it over into more of the growth stage, so to speak. And so usually in this intro stage, you see a very high failure rate simply because of the financial resources required to move products in this particular arena. So you usually see very high failure rate, but you also see little competition. And in this stage, typically you are oftentimes the first to market because no other company has proven that you can profitably, at least, sell this particular product. And so in this particular area, it might serve as an advantage because you don't deal with a very saturated market, much as you would companies that are occupying different stages of the life cycle. So moving on, once we get through the introduction stage, or I should say if we get through the introduction stage, we go through what we call the growth stage. And the growth stage is characterized by a number of different things that I'll go ahead and describe to you. In the growth stage, as you can see from sales, which is notated by this orange line here on your screen, we obviously have rising sales more significantly so than were rising previously. And so sales start to climb. The new product begins to attract more customers. The product slowly begins to show a profit. Obviously, as sales increase, it reduces, of course, the burden of those developmental costs. Maybe advertising expenditures aren't as significant simply because there's more awareness already. And what happens is, as a company that is occupying this stage, what happens is that you begin to see more competition. And we've seen this from a number of different things. An example, of course, is in 2007, Apple released the iPhone. And it was one of the first phones, not necessarily that was a smartphone per se, but that was very similar in style to what we see is more common now. And so Apple really pioneered kind of that design and that functionality, if you will, with the applications and different things of that nature. And it wasn't until they successfully implemented that, and then obviously did some sales and were becoming very, very popular, that you started to see new entrants into the market. You start to see Google's Android operating system. You start to see handsets made by HTC and made by Samsung and other competitors in that particular market, because once again, success tends to attract competitors. And ultimately, that's what tends to happen in the growth stage. And so what are some examples of growing products, of course, or products that occupy the growth stage? Tablet computers are, of course, a growing market, have been growing significantly over the last several quarters, and oftentimes continue to double with regards to sales. So that is certainly a growing industry, certainly an industry that's attracted a large number of competitors. We've seen just recently Microsoft coming out with the new Surface tablet. Google has developed its Nexus tablet and also tailored a larger 10-inch tablet, and you see a number of other players in the market obviously developing similar type products, because obviously if it's a growing industry, companies want to kind of locate in that particular industry as a way of maximizing sales, of course. So what happens in this stage is you deal with a great deal of product differentiation, because in the intro stage there's little competition, so there's no one to compete against. In the growth stage, because you start to see more entrants into the market, you have to start to differentiate your product in the minds of consumers, so ultimately you can stand your ground. And if that isn't the case, then you're going to be suffering because of the increased competition. All right, the next stage in the market, or in the product life cycle, I should say, is characterized by sales ultimately going through a decline portion. So we have what we call the maturity stage. And at the beginning of the maturity stage, sales are actually increasing still, as you can see here from this orange line on your screen. But eventually, in the maturity stage, we start to go through a point to which sales begin to decline. And they begin to decline at a pretty rapid rate, but it depends ultimately on that product. And so we know that the maturity stage is characterized by slowing sales growth. The highest profit level is typically reached in the early stages of the maturity phase. But what happens is because of increased competition, what this does is this causes people to compete on price. Product differentiation at some point doesn't work as much. And so what really happens is you start to have people competing on price, so you have a great deal of price cutting, of course. And for what we know about business is when you cut prices, that eats into ultimately what your profit margins are. So you have lower profit margins, which typically produce lower profits. You have increased advertising and promotional expenditures. You do a lot of sales promotions as a way of ultimately maybe doing discounts and various other things, so people will ultimately purchase your product over maybe a competitor's product. And towards the latter end of this stage, you usually have sales beginning to fall as you go into the last stage in the product life cycle. So some examples of products in the maturity phase include laptop computers, include netbook computers. You do have flat screen televisions are in the maturity type stages. Now, one of the things I need to mention is that products can stay in the maturity stage for decades. So although some products may go through the product life cycle rather quickly, like fads and different things that maybe are popular one week and then all of a sudden they're not anymore. Certain products can stay in these stages for a large period of time. So you look at, just for example, washers and dryers have been around for a number of different years. They're certainly not a growing industry, but it is a more mature type industry, and they've managed to keep those products in that industry through redesign, through retooling them, through adding interactive interfaces and all different types of features that obviously still make the product necessary. It's not growing, but they prevent it from going into this last stage here. And that last stage is one which we call decline. And the decline stage is characterized by both falling sales as well as profits, but you continue to be profitable in a sense. What tends to happen here in the declining stage is that a lot of companies withdraw a lot of the support that they had for their products and services in the maturity and the growth stage. Because in the declining stage, you typically have a lot of people exiting the market already because they realize that, well, you know what, this isn't going to be pursued for a long period of time. It's a saturated market, and the product itself isn't something that people are looking for, and so they try to kind of migrate to some of the more popular industries and popular products in different stages, of course. So you don't focus necessarily on that, but what happens is these products typically sell themselves. And so you don't need a great deal of promotional support or a great deal of advertising expenditures to actually sell the products. And so by not having those expenditures, that means that you can keep a little bit more of the profit. So you can still maintain a little bit of a profit margin in this particular stage, but you do have falling sales. Now, a great example of this, of course, are desktop computers today, and even, I'd mentioned laptop computers are maturing. We're beginning to see them transition more to a decline, although I don't know if they're necessarily in that stage. But every quarter, laptop sales decline as a percentage of the electronics market, if you will. And the same thing with desktop computers. You're beginning to see, although we still have them, there are companies like Apple, for example, that still have different revisions to existing desktop computer lines, but ultimately their sales are beginning to slow and decrease in number simply because of technology the way that it is. And it's very, very difficult with technology to be involved in the product life cycle because we can go through these things rather quickly, of course. So in addition to desktop computers, you have VCRs, obviously are declining, or have declined, I would say, in number drastically. AM, FM radios, specifically for those, are declining drastically. You even have iPods, for example, are in a declining type industry. You still see Apple making adjustments to them, making revisions to them, and changing the features, changing the design ultimately to kind of retool them so ultimately people will purchase them. But they continue to decline as sales every single quarter. And so that would be another example of a potential declining industry, although Apple still has obviously some support for them. So, I mean, the question here is if we know that ultimately products go through this life cycle, well, how do we keep them from going through them at a rapid pace? And that really just lies in the ability to redesign them and repurpose them. So certain products like baking soda, for example. Baking soda was originally designed to be a cooking type product, so used when you cook, and eventually went through this product life cycle. And so the company that made that particular product retooled it to have more of a emphasis with regards to deodorization. And so as it was sold from a different angle, right, repurposed, and it was promoted as doing something else, well, ultimately you kept baking soda in the product life cycle. It did not decline like we once thought it would because it was being sold for a specific way. So redesigning or retooling products is a great way to at least decrease the speed at which they go through the decline phase, of course. But this is exactly why companies map out the different products that they have, because they need to know at what stage they are occupying, because they want to make sure and have different products available that are going to be introduced and growing to compensate for the eventual decline in other products. And so this is characteristic in a number of different industries, and you certainly see it in the technology industry, technology sector, simply because technology has been changing so rapidly.